You don't touch a federal judge and expect to keep flying, sweetheart. Those words, spoken in the quiet authority of someone who had sent criminals to prison for 2 decades, would echo through Flight 847 long after the engines stopped running and the handcuffs clicked shut. The pre-dawn darkness of Miami felt heavy with humidity and unfinished business as Judge Victoria Washington sat in her hotel room at 4:47 a.m., surrounded by case files that could determine whether an innocent man lived or died. The fluorescent light above her desk flickered intermittently, casting dancing shadows across the photographs of crime scenes, witness statements, and DNA evidence that told a story of justice delayed but not denied. At 62, Victoria had learned to function on 3 hours of sleep when the law demanded it, and today the law was demanding everything she had to give. The wrongful conviction case of Marcus Williams had consumed her thoughts for 3 years ever since new evidence had surfaced suggesting that the man sitting on death row in Alabama had been nowhere near the convenience store robbery that had cost a young clerk his life. Today's hearing in Washington would determine whether Marcus got a new trial or whether the state would proceed with his execution in 37 days. Victoria's phone buzzed against the mahogany surface of the hotel desk, interrupting her review of the forensic timeline that didn't add up. The caller ID showed her law clerk, Jessica, who never called before 6 a.m. unless something significant had happened. Judge Washington. Victoria answered, not taking her eyes off the ballistics report that contradicted the prosecution's theory. Your Honor, I'm sorry to wake you, but see, NN is running a story about the Williams case. Jessica's voice carried the tension of someone delivering news that could complicate everything. They're calling it a race against time, and they've got legal analysts debating whether federal courts should intervene in state death penalty cases. The courthouse is going to be a circus when you get back. Victoria set down her reading glasses and rubbed her temples, feeling the familiar weight of cases that extended beyond legal precedent into the realm of public conscience. Have they been fair in their reporting? Mostly, but you know how these things go. They're focusing on the drama rather than the legal complexities, and there's already chatter about activist judges overstepping their authority. The accusation of judicial activism was one Victoria had heard throughout her career, particularly when her decisions favored defendants who looked like her or came from communities that had been historically marginalized by the justice system. She had learned long ago that doing the right thing often came with criticism from those who preferred the comfort of the status quo. I'll be back in chambers by noon, Victoria said, already mentally preparing for the media gauntlet that would greet her return to Washington. Make sure the security briefing is updated and have Detective Morris from Alabama ready to testify via video link if needed. After ending the call, Victoria moved to her suitcase, packing with the methodical precision of someone who traveled frequently but never carelessly. She folded her charcoal suit jacket, the one she had worn to her confirmation hearing 15 years ago, and placed it next to her emergency medication kit. The nitroglycerin tablets had become a necessary companion since her mild heart episode 2 years earlier, a reminder that stress and justice were often incompatible bedfellows. Her briefcase, worn leather that had accompanied her from prosecutor to judge, held not just legal documents but the weight of responsibility that came with holding people's lives in her hands. She had sentenced murderers and freed the wrongly accused, and each decision had taught her that justice was not a destination, but a continuous journey toward doing better. The taxi ride to Miami International Airport gave Victoria time to review her notes one final time, but her attention kept drifting to the city waking up around her. Street vendors setting up their stands, construction workers heading to job sites, children waiting for school buses, all of them living lives that could intersect with the justice system in ways they never anticipated. The Williams case wasn't just about one man on death row. It was about whether the system could admit its mistakes and correct them before it was too late. Airport security moved efficiently around Victoria, their professional courtesy masking the routine of lives spent maintaining order in spaces where thousands of strangers intersected daily. She presented her credentials with the same calm authority she brought to the bench, understanding that everyone was simply doing their job while hoping their day remained routine. The boarding pass for Flight 847 showed Seat 2A, a window seat that would allow her to work without interruption during the 3-hour flight to Washington. Victoria had specifically requested first class not for comfort, but for the space to spread out legal documents without curious passengers attempting to read over her shoulder. Privacy was essential when dealing with cases that could become front-page news. Meanwhile, 37-year-old flight attendant Brittany Nash was experiencing the kind of morning that felt like a preview of personal collapse. Her alarm had failed to sound, her coffee maker had broken mid-brew, and her mother's latest medical bill sat unopened on her kitchen counter like a ticking bomb. The $847 charge for emergency room treatment would consume most of her next paycheck, assuming she still had a job after yesterday's incident with the passenger who had complained about her attitude. Brittany's reflection in her bathroom mirror showed someone who had aged beyond her years. The stress of 8 years in customer service etched in lines around her eyes that makeup could no longer completely hide. Her platinum blonde hair, perfectly styled and sprayed into submission, was her armor against passengers who seemed to view flight attendants as either invisible servants or convenient targets for their travel frustrations. The drive to Miami International Airport gave Brittany time to rehearse the conversation she knew was coming with her supervisor about the passenger complaint. Mrs. Chen in 3B had accused her of being dismissive and unprofessional claims that Brittany felt were unfair, given that the woman had been demanding special treatment for her anxiety about turbulence on a perfectly calm flight. The complaint had come just 2 weeks after Brittany's request for transfer to international routes had been denied with the vague explanation that she needed to work on her interpersonal skills. The employee parking lot at the airport was already full, forcing Brittany to park in the expensive short-term section that would cost her $27 for the day. $27 that she couldn't afford to spend, but couldn't afford not to pay since parking violations could result in disciplinary action. The mathematics of working-class life had become a constant calculation of which financial pressures to address and which to postpone until the next paycheck. In the crew briefing room, Brittany met Tyler Morrison, the 22-year-old trainee who had been assigned to work with her on Flight 847. Tyler's enthusiasm for the job reminded Brittany of her own optimism 8 years earlier, before she had learned that passengers often viewed the crew as obstacles to their convenience rather than as safety professionals trained to handle emergencies. Mrs. Nash, I've reviewed the passenger manifest for today's flight, Tyler said, consulting his tablet with the careful attention of someone determined not to make mistakes. We have a full first-class cabin, mostly business travelers and government employees heading back to D.C. after meetings down here. Brittany nodded, scanning the list of names without really reading them. Her mind focused on the performance review she knew was coming and the promotion opportunities that seemed to be slipping away despite her years of service. The irony wasn't lost on her that she spent her days taking care of people who could afford first-class tickets while she struggled to pay for her mother's medical care on a salary that barely covered basic expenses. Remember Tyler? First class expects a certain level of service, Brittany said, adjusting her name tag and checking her appearance one final time. These passengers pay premium prices, and they want to feel like that money was well spent. We maintain order. We enforce the rules, and we don't let anyone think they can get special treatment just because they ask nicely. Tyler nodded eagerly, though something in his expression suggested uncertainty about where the line between service and enforcement should be drawn. Brittany had learned through experience that passengers would try to bend rules, make special requests, and generally treat the aircraft like their personal space, rather than a shared environment with safety requirements that applied to everyone equally. Flight 847 sat at Gate B12, its metal hull gleaming under the terminal lights as ground crews performed their pre-flight checks. The aircraft represented order routine and the kind of controlled environment where Brittany felt most competent. Passengers could be unpredictable, but procedures were clear, and following procedures had kept her employed even when her patience with difficult passengers had worn thin. As passengers began boarding, Brittany positioned herself at the aircraft door with her professional smile in place, the one that conveyed welcome without warmth, service without subservience. Each boarding pass scan was an opportunity to assess passengers for potential problems, and she had developed an instinct for identifying those who might challenge her authority or create disturbances that could reflect poorly on her performance evaluation. When Victoria Washington appeared at the aircraft door boarding pass in hand and carrying herself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being taken seriously, Brittany's trained assessment kicked in automatically. The woman's simple clothing and practical appearance didn't match Brittany's mental image of someone who could afford first-class tickets, and her worn briefcase suggested either financial constraints or a lack of concern for appearances that Brittany associated with people trying to look more important than they actually were. "Good morning, welcome aboard," Brittany said, her smile maintaining its professional distance as she scanned Victoria's boarding pass. "Seat 2. A right up there on the left." Victoria nodded politely and moved past her into the first-class cabin, settling into her window seat with the efficient movements of someone who traveled frequently enough to have developed routines. She placed her briefcase under the seat in front of her and retrieved her reading glasses from her jacket pocket, immediately beginning to review documents that were clearly related to legal work. Brittany watched from the galley as Victoria organized her workspace, noting the way the woman commanded the space around her seat without appearing to try. There was something about her posture, the way she held her head, the deliberate precision of her movements that suggested authority in a way that made Brittany unconsciously straighten her own spine. Tyler appeared beside her, consulting his passenger service checklist with the determination of someone trying to prove his competence. "Should I offer her something to drink? I know you said first-class passengers expect prompt service." "Let her get settled first," Brittany replied, continuing to observe Victoria's methodical review of what appeared to be official documents marked with red stamps and official seals. Some passengers just want to be left alone, and others expect to be waited on hand and foot. You learn to read the signs. As the boarding process continued, the first-class cabin filled with the typical mix of business travelers, government employees, and tourists who had either saved up for an upgrade or been bumped up due to oversold conditions in economy. Brittany's attention kept returning to the woman in 2A who had requested a glass of water for what she had mentioned was heart medication, but otherwise seemed content to work quietly at her seat. Something about Victoria's presence unsettled Brittany in a way she couldn't quite identify. Perhaps it was the woman's apparent comfort with being alone, or the way she seemed to assume that her requests would be accommodated without question, or simply the fact that she didn't fit Brittany's mental category of typical first-class passengers. Whatever the source of her unease, Brittany found herself paying more attention to seat 2A than to the other passengers who were still boarding. The final passengers were finding their seats as Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the aircraft intercom, announcing the completion of boarding and the beginning of pre-flight safety procedures. Brittany moved through the first-class cabin, performing her required safety checks with the automatic precision of someone who had repeated the same routine thousands of times. When she reached row 2, Victoria was in the process of taking a small white tablet from a prescription bottle, a routine that was clearly familiar and medically necessary. Her tote bag remained on her lap, easily accessible should she need additional medication during the flight. An arrangement that was completely reasonable and entirely within the bounds of federal aviation regulations. But something about the scene triggered Brittany's instinct for maintaining order, the same instinct that had led to yesterday's passenger complaint and her supervisor's warning about attitude problems. In her mind, rules were rules, and allowing one passenger to bend them could lead to chaos, as others demanded similar exceptions. Ma'am, Brittany said, her voice carrying the tone of authority that had served her well in previous confrontations with difficult passengers. All personal items need to be stowed under the seat in front of you or in the overhead compartment before we can push back from the gate. Victoria looked up from her medication with the measured attention of someone accustomed to being interrupted but not accustomed to being spoken to without courtesy. Her steel-gray eyes met Brittany's with a directness that was neither challenging nor deferential, simply the gaze of someone expecting a reasonable conversation between adults. "I understand the requirement," Victoria replied, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from years of speaking in courtrooms where every word mattered. "I'm taking my heart medication as prescribed by my physician, and once I've done so, the bag will go under the seat where it belongs." The response was perfectly reasonable, delivered without attitude or defiance, but something about Victoria's calm assumption that her explanation would be sufficient irritated Brittany in a way that surprised her with its intensity. Perhaps it was the stress of her morning, or the financial pressures that made every interaction feel like a test of her competence, or simply the accumulated frustration of 8 years spent explaining rules to people who seemed to think they deserved exceptions. "Ma'am, federal aviation regulations don't make allowances for personal convenience," Brittany said, her voice rising slightly as other passengers began to notice the interaction. "The captain has announced that we're preparing for pushback, which means all personal items must be secured immediately, not when it's convenient for you." Tyler appeared at Brittany's shoulder, his young face showing concern at the escalating tone of the conversation. He had been trained to de-escalate passenger conflicts, but he had also been taught to support his senior colleague's authority, creating a conflict between his training and his instincts that left him uncertain how to respond. Victoria's expression remained calm, but her grip on the medication bottle tightened slightly as she recognized the familiar dynamic of someone using authority to compensate for their own insecurity. She had seen it countless times in her courtroom lawyers, defendants, even fellow judges who confused power with competence and mistakes firmness for fairness. "Young lady, I'm not asking for special treatment," Victoria said, her voice maintaining its professional courtesy despite the growing tension. "I'm taking prescribed medication for a cardiac condition which I will finish doing in approximately 15 seconds, after which my bag will be properly stowed. I've been flying this route twice a week for 10 years, and I'm quite familiar with safety requirements." The mention of her experience and the implicit correction about safety procedures struck Brittany as exactly the kind of condescending attitude that she had learned to resist from passengers who thought their frequent flyer status gave them the right to lecture crew members about their own jobs. The passenger in 1B, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, had pulled out his phone and was discreetly recording the interaction, adding the pressure of potential social media exposure to an already tense situation. "Ma'am, I don't have time to debate federal regulations with passengers," Brittany said, stepping closer to Victoria's seat in what she intended as a display of authority, but which came across as an invasion of personal space. "You can take your medication after we're airborne, but right now I need that bag stowed or we're not moving." Arthur Chen, the lobbyist in seat 1B, continued recording while trying to appear as if he was simply checking his phone. He had worked in Washington long enough to recognize authority when he saw it, and something about the woman in 2A suggested that this confrontation was heading toward a conclusion that the flight attendant wouldn't appreciate. Victoria slowly placed the medication bottle back in her tote bag, her movements deliberate and controlled in the way of someone who had learned that remaining calm in the face of unreasonable behavior was often the most effective response. She looked up at Brittany with an expression that somehow managed to be both understanding and disappointed, as if she were looking at a promising law student who had just made a fundamental error in judgment. "I'm going to give you an opportunity to reconsider your approach here," Victoria said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of understated authority that made Tyler step back involuntarily. "I am taking legally prescribed medication for a documented medical condition. I am not violating any federal regulation, any airline policy, or any reasonable interpretation of safety requirements. What I am doing is trying to prevent a cardiac event during takeoff, which I would think you would want to avoid for the safety and comfort of all passengers." The reasonable tone of Victoria's response, combined with her apparent assumption that logic would prevail, pushed Brittany past the point where training or common sense might have guided her behavior. She had spent the morning dealing with financial stress, professional criticism, and the accumulated weight of years spent defending her authority against passengers who seemed to view her as an obstacle to their convenience. "Ma'am, I am the safety authority on this aircraft until we land in Washington," Brittany declared, her voice loud enough to carry throughout the first-class cabin. "I don't care if you're taking aspirin or heart medication or vitamins. Federal regulations require all personal items to be stowed during taxi and takeoff, and I'm not making exceptions because you think your medical needs are more important than aviation safety." Victoria's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the disappointment in her eyes deepening into something that looked remarkably like pity. She had dealt with enough frightened, angry people in her courtroom to recognize someone who was operating from a place of insecurity rather than genuine authority. But she had also learned that reasoning with people in that state often required a different approach than logic alone. "I need to see your name tag," Victoria said calmly, beginning to rise from her seat with the measured movements of someone who was about to take control of a situation that had moved beyond reasonable discourse. Brittany's hand moved instinctively to her chest where her name tag was positioned, but instead of complying with the request, she stepped even closer to Victoria, using her standing position to loom over the older woman who was still seated and therefore at a physical disadvantage. "You need to sit down and stow your bag," Brittany commanded, her voice carrying the kind of sharp authority that she had used successfully with other passengers, but which seemed to bounce off Victoria like water off stone. "I don't have to give you my name, and I don't have to explain federal regulations to someone who apparently thinks rules don't apply to them." Tyler looked desperately toward the cockpit, hoping that Captain Rodriguez might emerge and take control of a situation that was clearly escalating beyond normal passenger service issues. Several other passengers had stopped their pre-flight activities to watch the confrontation, and the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted from the usual pre-departure calm to something that felt uncomfortably charged with potential conflict. Victoria completed her movement to a standing position, and despite being several inches shorter than Brittany, her presence somehow filled the space around row 2 in a way that made the flight attendant step back involuntarily. There was something about her posture, the way she held her shoulders, the complete absence of fear or uncertainty in her expression, that suggested this was a woman accustomed to being obeyed rather than challenged. "I am going to ask you one more time for your name and employee number," Victoria said, her voice dropping to a level that somehow carried more authority than Brittany's shouting had managed. "After that, I'm going to make a phone call that will end this conversation in a way that you're not going to appreciate." The threat was delivered so calmly with such complete confidence that it cut through Brittany's anger and triggered a moment of uncertainty. Something about the way Victoria spoke, the precision of her words, the complete absence of bluster or emotional escalation, suggested that this was not an empty threat from a frustrated passenger, but a statement of fact from someone who possessed the means to follow through. But Brittany had committed herself to this confrontation, and backing down now would feel like admitting that she had been wrong to enforce what she believed were legitimate safety requirements. Her supervisor's criticism about attitude problems echoed in her mind, along with the financial pressures that made keeping her job essential and the accumulated frustration of years spent defending her authority against passengers who seemed to think they deserved special treatment. "Ma'am, you are being disruptive and non-compliant with crew instructions," Brittany announced loudly enough for everyone in first class to hear clearly. "If you continue to refuse to follow safety requirements, I will have no choice but to have you removed from this aircraft for the safety and security of all passengers and crew." Arthur Chen continued recording, now openly holding his phone in a way that captured both women clearly. He had covered enough political scandals in Washington to recognize when someone was making a career-ending mistake, and his instincts told him that the flight attendant was about 30 seconds away from discovering exactly who she was threatening to have removed from the aircraft. Victoria reached into her jacket pocket and retrieved her cell phone, a simple, practical device that looked unremarkable except for the federal government seal that served as its wallpaper. She unlocked the phone with her thumb and scrolled through her contacts with the unhurried movements of someone who was completely confident in her next course of action. "Put that phone away immediately." Brittany shrieked, her professional composure finally cracking completely as she realized she was losing control of the situation. "Electronic devices must be in airplane mode during taxi and takeoff, and I will not have you endangering this aircraft with your selfish disregard for federal aviation regulations." Victoria ignored the outburst, completely pressing a contact labeled Director Reynolds, U.S. Marshals, and raising the phone to her ear. The fact that she had the director of the U.S. Marshals Service on speed dial might have given Brittany pause if she had been thinking clearly, but anger and adrenaline had pushed her past the point where she was capable of recognizing warning signs. "Director Reynolds." Victoria said into the phone, her voice carrying clearly throughout the first-class cabin in the sudden silence that had fallen over the other passengers. "This is Judge Washington. I'm currently seated aboard Flight 847 at Miami International Airport, and I need to report that I've just been physically threatened and verbally assaulted by a member of the flight crew." The words Judge Washington hit Brittany like a physical blow, but the full implications didn't penetrate her consciousness immediately. She was focused on regaining control of what she still perceived as a passenger service issue, not processing the possibility that she might have just threatened a federal judge. "Ma'am, you need to end that call immediately and comply with crew instructions," Brittany demanded, reaching toward Victoria's phone in what she intended as an assertive gesture of authority, but which would later be described by witnesses as an attempted grab for a federal judge's communication device. Victoria smoothly stepped back, avoiding Brittany's reach while continuing her phone conversation with the same calm professionalism she brought to capital punishment cases. "Yes, Director, the crew member has just attempted to physically interfere with my communication to federal authorities. I'm going to need marshals on scene and this aircraft secured until they arrive." Brittany's world began to shift in ways she didn't yet fully understand as Victoria continued speaking into her phone, but her immediate response was still driven by her perception that a passenger was defying her authority and potentially endangering the aircraft by using unauthorized communications during pre-flight procedures. "I'm calling the captain," Brittany announced, moving toward the cockpit with the intention of getting someone with greater authority to support her enforcement of what she believed were legitimate safety requirements. "We have a disruptive passenger who is refusing to comply with federal aviation regulations and is now making unauthorized phone calls during departure procedures." But Victoria was still speaking, and her next words reached every passenger in the first-class cabin with crystal clarity. "Director, I need you to contact the tower immediately and revoke this aircraft's departure clearance. The flight crew has created an unsafe environment, and I want this plane grounded until federal marshals can board and take the crew member who assaulted me into custody." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the ambient noise of the aircraft's systems and the distant sounds of airport operations filtering through the cabin walls. Arthur Chen's phone continued recording, capturing every word of what had just become a federal incident involving a sitting judge and a flight attendant who apparently had no idea what she had just triggered. Tyler stared at Victoria with the expression of someone watching a traffic accident in slow motion, finally understanding that whatever was about to happen next would be far beyond anything his training had prepared him to handle. Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom, asking for the lead flight attendant to report to the cockpit, immediately unaware that the lead flight attendant had just created a situation that would require federal intervention to resolve. Victoria ended her call and looked at Brittany with an expression that somehow managed to be both professional and final, as if she were looking at a defendant who had just sealed their own fate through their choices in her courtroom. Miss Nash, Victoria said, reading the name tag that Brittany had tried to keep hidden. "I am Judge Victoria Washington of the United States District Court for the District of Columbia. You have just physically threatened a federal judge, interfered with official federal communications, and created a dangerous situation aboard a commercial aircraft. I suggest you take a seat and wait quietly for the marshals to arrive, because anything else you do or say at this point will only make your situation worse." The transformation in the first-class cabin was immediate and absolute, like the moment when a peaceful sky suddenly fills with storm clouds that block out the sun completely. Passengers who had been absorbed in their newspapers, laptops, and phone calls were now staring openly at the unfolding drama, their expressions ranging from shock to fascination to the kind of horrified anticipation that comes with witnessing someone's complete professional destruction in real time. Arthur Chen had stopped pretending to be discreet about his recording and was now holding his phone openly capturing every moment of what he recognized as a career-ending catastrophe that would likely become national news within hours. The lobbyist had seen enough political scandals to know when someone had crossed a line from which there was no return, and Brittany Nash had just sprinted across that line while setting it on fire behind her. Brittany stood frozen in the aircraft aisle, her brain struggling to process information that didn't fit with her perception of the situation she thought she had been managing. The woman she had been treating as a difficult passenger who needed to be put in her place had just identified herself as a federal judge, spoken to the director of the U.S. Marshals Service as if they were personal contacts, and somehow managed to ground a commercial aircraft with a single phone call. "You're lying," Brittany said weakly, her voice carrying none of the authority she had projected moments earlier. "You're just trying to intimidate me because I enforced safety regulations. Passengers can't just claim to be judges to get special treatment." Victoria reached into her briefcase, the same briefcase that Brittany had dismissed as evidence of the woman's modest circumstances, and withdrew a leather credential case that she opened to reveal a federal judiciary identification card complete with official seals. Her photograph and security features that would be impossible to fake. She held it at a distance where Brittany could read it clearly, but couldn't attempt to grab it. "Judge Victoria Washington, United States District Court for the District of Columbia," Victoria said calmly, appointed by President Obama in 2009, confirmed by the Senate with bipartisan support, currently presiding over Capital Region federal cases including death penalty appeals, civil rights violations, and federal criminal prosecutions. Tyler Morrison felt his legs go weak as the implications of what had just happened crashed over him like a collapsing building. His training had covered difficult passengers, medical emergencies, mechanical problems, and even potential security threats, but nothing had prepared him for the scenario where his supervising flight attendant had just physically confronted a sitting federal judge and triggered what appeared to be a federal law enforcement response. Captain Rodriguez emerged from the cockpit looking annoyed and confused, clearly expecting to deal with a routine passenger service issue that had gotten out of hand. He was an experienced pilot who had handled everything from medical emergencies to unruly passengers, but the scene that greeted him in the first-class cabin was unlike anything in his 2 decades of commercial aviation. "What's the situation here?" Captain Rodriguez asked, his attention focused initially on Brittany, whom he naturally assumed was the authority figure in whatever passenger conflict had developed. "Captain, we have a passenger who has been non-compliant with safety regulations." Brittany began trying to regain control of the narrative, even as she could feel her world collapsing around her. She refused to stow her personal items during departure procedures, became argumentative when I explained federal aviation requirements, and is now making false claims about her identity to avoid following crew instructions. Victoria handed her federal credentials to Captain Rodriguez without comment, allowing the official documentation to speak for itself. The captain's face went through a rapid series of expressions as he processed the information. Confusion giving way to recognition, recognition giving way to alarm, and alarm giving way to the kind of panic that comes with realizing that a routine flight has become a federal incident. "Judge Washington," Captain Rodriguez stammered, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to shift mental gears from passenger service to damage control. "I apologize for any misunderstanding. If there's been a problem with our service, I'm sure we can resolve it quickly and professionally." "Captain, there hasn't been a misunderstanding," Victoria replied, her voice maintaining the same professional calm she had used throughout the confrontation. "Your flight attendant physically threatened me when I attempted to take prescribed cardiac medication, interfered with my federal communications when I tried to report the incident, and has created an unsafe environment aboard this aircraft. I've contacted the U.S. Marshals Service, and this flight is not going anywhere until they arrive." The cabin fell completely silent except for the ambient sounds of the aircraft systems and the increasingly frantic radio chatter coming from the cockpit as air traffic control tried to understand why Flight 847 had requested an emergency ground stop with federal law enforcement response. Other passengers were beginning to pull out their phones, some to record the continuing drama and others to call family members and employers to report that their flight had been delayed due to what appeared to be a federal incident. Brittany looked desperately at Captain Rodriguez, hoping for support from someone with greater authority who might be able to restore her version of events and salvage her position. "Captain, I was enforcing federal aviation regulations exactly as I've been trained to do. This passenger was non-compliant with safety requirements, and when I insisted that she follow the rules, she became hostile and started making threats." "Miss Nash," Captain Rodriguez said quietly, studying Victoria's federal credentials with the expression of someone reading his own professional obituary, "I need you to return to the galley and wait there until further notice. Do not interact with any passengers, do not make any statements, and do not leave the aircraft under any circumstances." Through the aircraft windows, the first signs of the federal response were becoming visible on the tarmac. 3 black SUVs with government plates were racing across the airport ground, their emergency lights flashing as they bypassed normal airport traffic patterns and headed directly toward Flight 847's gate. Behind them, Miami-Dade airport police vehicles were following their officers, undoubtedly confused about why federal marshals had requested immediate response to what had initially been reported as a passenger service issue. Arthur Chen continued recording while simultaneously typing rapid-fire text messages to his contacts at various news organizations, recognizing that he was witnessing the kind of story that could lead the evening news cycle if handled properly. The combination of airline drama, federal authority, and what appeared to be spectacular professional misconduct created exactly the kind of narrative that captured public attention and drove social media engagement. Victoria remained calm as the response unfolded around her, occasionally checking her watch as if she were concerned about missing her scheduled hearing rather than dealing with the aftermath of being assaulted by airline personnel. Her experience in handling high-stress legal situations had taught her the value of maintaining professional composure even when dealing with people who had allowed their emotions to override their judgment. "Judge Washington," Captain Rodriguez said carefully, clearly trying to minimize the damage that this incident would cause to his airline, his crew, and his own career. "Is there anything we can do to make you more comfortable while we wait for the authorities to arrive? Can I get you something to drink, or would you prefer to wait in a different location?" "Captain, I'm perfectly comfortable in the seat I paid for," Victoria replied, settling back into 2A with her case files spread out before her as if nothing unusual had happened. "I do need to make some phone calls to reschedule my hearing in Washington, since it appears I won't be arriving on time due to this incident." The radio chatter from the cockpit was becoming more intense as air traffic control tried to coordinate the ground response while maintaining normal airport operations around what had become a federal crime scene. Other flights were being held or rerouted as Miami International Airport security worked with federal marshals to secure the gate area and prepare for what appeared to be a law enforcement boarding of a commercial aircraft. Brittany sat in the galley jump seat, her hands shaking as the full scope of her situation began to penetrate her consciousness. She had physically confronted a federal judge, interfered with federal communications, and created a situation that had triggered a multi-agency law enforcement response. Her career in aviation was over, but that might be the least of her problems if the federal authorities decided to pursue criminal charges. Tyler tried to make himself invisible while providing basic passenger service to the increasingly agitated travelers who were beginning to understand that their flight delay was connected to some kind of serious incident involving the flight crew. His professional training told him to maintain normal operations, but his common sense told him that nothing about this situation was normal and that his association with Brittany's actions might have consequences for his own employment. The heavy thud of the jet bridge repositioning interrupted the tense quiet in the cabin, followed by the sound of multiple sets of footsteps moving quickly through the boarding tunnel toward the aircraft door. Captain Rodriguez moved to meet whoever was boarding his face, showing the strain of someone who understood that the next few minutes would determine whether this incident remained a passenger complaint or escalated into a federal investigation of airline operations. The aircraft door opened with its characteristic mechanical sound, and 4 men in dark suits entered the cabin with the purposeful movements of law enforcement officers responding to a federal incident. They wore the tactical vests and badges of U.S. Marshals, and their leader, a tall man with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command, surveyed the first-class cabin with professional efficiency. "I'm Deputy Marshal Thompson," the lead officer announced, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that immediately commanded attention from everyone in the cabin. "We're looking for Judge Victoria Washington and the crew member who's been reported for assault on a federal officer." Victoria raised her hand slightly from her seat, the gesture calm and controlled. "I'm Judge Washington, Deputy Marshal. The crew member in question is currently in the galley area." Brittany felt every eye in the cabin turn toward her as she sat in the jump seat, her airline uniform suddenly feeling like a costume that no longer fit the role she was supposed to be playing. The professional confidence that had carried her through 8 years of passenger service had evaporated completely, leaving behind someone who looked very much like a frightened woman who had made the worst mistake of her life. "Ma'am, I need you to stand up slowly and keep your hands visible," Deputy Marshal Thompson said, approaching Brittany with the measured caution of someone trained to handle potentially volatile situations. "You're being detained in connection with assault on a federal officer, and we need to remove you from this aircraft for further questioning." The words "assault on a federal officer" hit the cabin like a physical blow, finally making clear to every passenger exactly what kind of incident they had just witnessed. This wasn't a customer service dispute or a misunderstanding about airline policies. This was a federal crime that could result in years in prison for the flight attendant who had been enforcing what she believed were safety regulations. "I was doing my job," Brittany said weakly, as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own labored breathing. "I was enforcing federal aviation regulations exactly as I've been trained to do." She wouldn't comply with safety requirements. "Ma'am, you have the right to remain silent," Deputy Marshal Thompson recited as he guided Brittany toward the aircraft door. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney, and if you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you." Arthur Chen captured every moment of the arrest on his phone, recognizing that the footage would likely be broadcast on national news within hours and shared millions of times across social media platforms. The image of a flight attendant being led away in handcuffs while passengers watched in stunned silence would become the defining visual of a story about authority, abuse of power, and the consequences of misjudging exactly who you're dealing with. As Brittany disappeared through the aircraft door, escorted by federal marshals who treated her with professional courtesy but absolute firmness, the cabin fell into the kind of silence that follows a natural disaster or a traffic accident. The quiet of people processing an event that had changed everything in ways they were still trying to understand. Victoria remained in her seat, calmly reviewing her case files as if being assaulted by airline personnel, and having to call federal marshals was simply another minor inconvenience in her judicial schedule. Her professional composure in the face of the chaos around her only reinforced the impression that this was someone accustomed to wielding real authority rather than the borrowed authority that came with an airline uniform. Captain Rodriguez stood at the front of the cabin, clearly struggling to find words that might restore some sense of normalcy to a situation that had moved far beyond normal operational procedures. His airline would face federal investigation. His crew member was in federal custody, and his aircraft had become a crime scene that would require documentation and investigation before normal service could resume. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Rodriguez finally announced over the intercom, his voice carrying the strain of someone delivering news he had never expected to share due to a federal law enforcement incident. Flight 847 will be delayed indefinitely while authorities complete their investigation. We apologize for the inconvenience and appreciate your patience as we work with federal officials to resolve this situation. The wheels of federal justice began turning with the mechanical precision of a system designed to process serious crimes efficiently. And Brittany Nash found herself caught in machinery that operated according to rules very different from the airline policies she had spent 8 years learning to enforce. The holding cell beneath the federal courthouse in downtown Miami smelled of industrial disinfectant and fear, a combination that seemed to seep into her skin and remind her constantly that her life as she had known it was over. 14 hours after her arrest, Brittany sat across a metal table from Assistant U.S. Attorney Maria Santos, a woman whose expensive suit and confident bearing represented everything Brittany had once aspired to achieve through hard work and rule-following. The federal prosecutor spread photographs across the table like playing cards in a game where Brittany had already lost without understanding the stakes. "Miss Nash, these images were taken by multiple passengers aboard Flight 847. Santos said, her voice carrying the professional distance of someone who dealt with criminal behavior as a matter of routine rather than drama. "They show you physically confronting Judge Washington, attempting to grab her personal property and interfering with her federal communications. The federal charges include assault on a federal officer, interference with federal judicial proceedings, and deprivation of civil rights under color of authority." Brittany stared at the photographs that showed her from angles she had never considered captured in moments when her face displayed emotions she barely remembered feeling. In one image, she was leaning over Victoria with her finger pointed accusingly. In another, she was reaching for the judge's phone with an expression that looked more like rage than professional enforcement of safety regulations. "I was doing my job." Brittany whispered the same words she had repeated to everyone who would listen since her arrest, though they sounded increasingly hollow each time she said them. "I was enforcing federal aviation regulations. She wouldn't comply with safety requirements." Santos opened a thick file and withdrew Victoria's federal credentials, spreading them across the table next to the incriminating photographs. "Judge Washington has been flying this route twice a week for 10 years without incident. She was taking prescribed cardiac medication exactly as federal disability accommodation laws require. You had no legal authority to prevent her from doing so, and you certainly had no authority to physically threaten her when she attempted to report your behavior." The legal documents scattered across the table represented a level of federal authority that Brittany was only beginning to understand. Victoria Washington wasn't just any federal judge. She was a senior member of the D.C. District Court who had written opinions that shaped federal law overseeing capital punishment cases that attracted national attention and maintained professional relationships with federal law enforcement agencies at the highest levels. "The judge has submitted a written statement requesting leniency in your sentencing." Santos continued sliding another document across the table. "She's asked the court to consider that you were operating under stress and may have genuinely believed you were enforcing safety regulations despite the fact that you clearly weren't." Brittany's hands trembled as she read Victoria's statement, written in the same precise legal language that had characterized every interaction they'd had aboard the aircraft. The judge had described Brittany's behavior as misguided rather than malicious, stressed rather than criminal, and had specifically requested that the federal sentencing take into account the financial pressures and professional insecurity that might have contributed to her poor judgment. "Why would she ask for leniency?" Brittany asked, looking up from the statement with confused tears blurring her vision. "I threatened her. I grabbed her bag. I tried to stop her from calling for help." Santos leaned back in her chair, studying Brittany with the analytical attention of someone trained to understand human motivation in its most complicated forms. Judge Washington has spent 20 years dealing with people who made terrible decisions under pressure. She understands the difference between someone who's genuinely dangerous and someone who's made mistakes that have consequences far beyond what they intended. The plea bargain offered 14 months in federal prison followed by 3 years of supervised probation. A sentence that would destroy Brittany's career in aviation, but allow her to rebuild some kind of life after paying the price for her actions. The alternative was facing trial on federal charges that could result in 8 years in prison if a jury decided that her behavior constituted a deliberate assault on federal authority, rather than a tragic misunderstanding. 6 weeks later, Brittany stood in federal court wearing a borrowed suit that didn't fit properly, facing Judge William Morrison, who had drawn the unpleasant task of sentencing someone for assaulting one of his judicial colleagues. The courtroom gallery was packed with reporters, aviation industry representatives, and federal employees who wanted to see how the system would handle an attack on judicial authority. Miss Nash, Judge Morrison said, looking down at her from the bench with an expression that mixed disappointment with duty. "You were entrusted with the safety and security of air travelers, and, instead of protecting them, you created a dangerous situation aboard a federal aircraft by assaulting a sitting federal judge who was simply trying to take prescribed medication." Victoria sat in the first row of the gallery wearing the same charcoal suit she had worn on the aircraft, her presence serving as a reminder of the dignity she had maintained throughout an incident that could have destroyed someone with less professional composure. She had submitted additional written statements supporting leniency, describing Brittany's behavior as a cautionary tale about how stress and insecurity could lead decent people to make devastating choices. However, Judge Morrison continued, "Judge Washington has made a compelling case that you were operating under significant personal and professional pressure, and that your actions, while completely inexcusable, were driven more by poor judgment than criminal intent. Therefore, the court accepts the plea agreement and sentences you to 14 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation." The gavel came down with the finality of a door closing, and Brittany felt the last vestiges of her old life disappear as the bailiffs approached to process her transfer to federal custody. As she was led away, she caught a glimpse of Victoria in the gallery, and for a moment their eyes met across the courtroom in a look that somehow contained both accountability and forgiveness. 8 months later, the letter arrived at the Federal Correctional Facility in Tallahassee on expensive paper that felt different from the rough institutional materials that had become Brittany's daily reality. The return address showed Judge Victoria Washington's chambers in the D.C. Federal Courthouse, and the carefully crafted handwriting suggested that this was a personal communication rather than official court business. Miss Nash. The letter began. "I have been thinking about our encounter aboard Flight 847 and the circumstances that led to the unfortunate events that followed. While your behavior was completely unacceptable, I have come to understand that you were operating under pressures that I failed to recognize at the time." Brittany read the letter 3 times before its full meaning penetrated her consciousness. Victoria was accepting partial responsibility for the incident, acknowledging that her own privileged position had made her less sensitive to the economic and professional pressures that had driven Brittany's poor decisions. The judge was offering not just forgiveness, but understanding, extending empathy to someone who had threatened and humiliated her in front of a cabin full of witnesses. "I would like to visit you before your release to discuss how we might work together to prevent similar incidents in the future." The letter continued. I believe that your experience properly channeled could help train other service industry workers about appropriate responses to stress and conflict. Your voice in preventing workplace discrimination and abuse of authority could be more powerful than any judicial decision I might write. 2 weeks later, Victoria sat across from Brittany in the prison visiting room, both women wearing simple clothing that somehow emphasized their shared humanity rather than their different circumstances. The federal judge who had sent Brittany to prison had driven 4 hours from Washington to offer her a chance at redemption that went far beyond simply serving her sentence and moving on. "I've been thinking about what happened between us," Victoria said, her voice carrying the same calm authority that had characterized their confrontation, but now directed toward healing rather than accountability. "You were wrong to treat me the way you did. But I was wrong to assume that everyone has the same resources and support systems that have allowed me to remain calm under pressure." Brittany struggled to find words adequate to express her gratitude and remorse, settling finally on simple honesty. "Judge Washington I was so angry about everything in my life that I took it out on you. I saw someone I thought I could push around, and I never stopped to think about who you were as a person, or whether what I was doing was right." Victoria smiled, the first genuine warmth Brittany had seen from her since their initial meeting aboard the aircraft. "Brittany, we all make mistakes when we're scared and overwhelmed. The question isn't whether we've failed, it's whether we can learn from our failures and use them to help other people avoid the same mistakes." They spent 2 hours discussing Brittany's experiences in the service industry, the pressures that had contributed to her poor judgment, and the ways that workplace training might be improved to help employees handle stress and conflict more effectively. Victoria offered to write letters supporting Brittany's early release and to help her find work in victim advocacy when she completed her sentence. "I want you to speak to airline personnel about what happened between us," Victoria said as their visit concluded. "Not to humiliate you, but to help them understand how quickly professional disagreements can escalate into life-changing mistakes. Your story told honestly could prevent other people from making the same choices you made." On a crisp October morning, 14 months after her arrest, Brittany walked out of federal prison carrying a single box of possessions and a letter of recommendation from Judge Victoria Washington. The woman who had once enforced airline policies with rigid authority had been replaced by someone who understood that true authority came from service rather than power, and that dignity was something you gave to others rather than something you demanded for yourself. Victoria was waiting in the parking lot, sitting behind the wheel of a modest sedan that reflected her practical approach to life rather than her federal salary. She had driven down from Washington to personally escort Brittany to her new job with a victim advocacy organization that helped service industry workers navigate conflicts before they escalated into criminal behavior. "Are you ready to help other people avoid the mistakes we both made?" Victoria asked as Brittany settled into the passenger seat. Both women understanding that their shared experience had changed them in ways that went far beyond legal consequences. "I think I finally am," Brittany replied, looking back at the federal facility that had been her home for over a year, but would now become part of a story about redemption rather than just punishment. "Thank you for seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself." 1 year later, Brittany stood before a group of airline personnel at a training facility in Atlanta, sharing her story with the honest directness of someone who had learned that vulnerability could be more powerful than authority. Victoria sat in the back of the room listening to Brittany describe their confrontation and its aftermath as a cautionary tale about the importance of treating every passenger with dignity and respect. "I thought my uniform gave me the right to judge people," Brittany told the assembled flight attendants, ground crew members, and supervisors. "I thought enforcing rules meant treating people as obstacles rather than human beings. Judge Washington taught me that real authority comes from serving others, not from making them feel small." After the training session, Victoria and Brittany walked together through the airport terminal where their story had begun, watching travelers navigate the complicated process of commercial aviation with the patience and courtesy that came from understanding that everyone was simply trying to get somewhere safely. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had just let you take your medication in peace?" Brittany asked, as they sat in the departure lounge watching planes take off through the enormous windows. Victoria considered the question seriously before answering. "I think we both needed to learn something that we couldn't have learned any other way. You needed to understand that authority without compassion becomes abuse. And I needed to understand that my privilege sometimes makes me blind to other people's struggles." As Flight 847 to Washington was called for boarding, both women stood and prepared to continue their separate journeys forever, connected by a moment when justice and mercy had intersected in ways that neither of them had expected. They had learned that redemption was possible even after the worst mistakes, that forgiveness could transform both the forgiver and the forgiven, and that sometimes the most important lessons came from the people we least expected to teach us. The plane took off on schedule, carrying passengers who would never know that their safe and courteous treatment was partly the result of two women who had chosen to turn their conflict into an opportunity for growth, understanding, and the kind of change that made the world a little more just and a little more kind with each person they helped along the way. If this story of transformation and redemption moved you, please like and subscribe to our channel for more stories about justice, forgiveness, and the power of second chances. Share your thoughts about how confronting our mistakes can lead to growth in the comments below, and let us know about times when someone's grace changed your perspective on conflict and accountability.